He didn't look at me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just named our baby, after his mother. And when I thought I couldn't hurt more, the nurse leaned in and whispered, "Do you want me to tell him the truth?" That's when everything changed. The cold winter air outside seemed to freeze everything in its path, as I lay in that sterile, dimly lit hospital room. The ache in my body was like nothing I had ever experienced before, each contraction more intense than the last, yet it was a small price to pay for the new life that was soon to enter the world. The exhaustion from 18 hours of labor left me disoriented, my body screaming for rest, yet my heart was full of anticipation. I could already hear it in my mind, the sound of my baby's first cry. That moment, I thought, would be the most beautiful moment of my life. I had imagined that my husband, Daniel, would be beside me, his hand in mine, looking down at our daughter with the same overwhelming joy I felt. I had imagined him looking at me with love, with tenderness, like the moment we had dreamed of for so long. But as the minutes dragged on and the pain became unbearable, I began to wonder, what if this wasn't the moment I had envisioned? And then, the moment arrived. The nurse placed the tiny, red-faced baby in my arms, her eyes still closed in peaceful slumber. My heart raced as I held her for the first time, still in shock from the physical toll, but feeling that indescribable connection. Yet, before I could even fully adjust her weight in my arms, Daniel stepped forward. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask if I was okay, or if I wanted anything. He just reached out, snatching the birth certificate papers from the nurse's hands. I was taken aback. The nurse, an older woman with deep-set eyes and a sharp face, flinched at the movement, stepping back slightly, as if she understood what was happening, but I didn't. Daniel, without missing a beat, bowed his head and started to write. The ink of the pen scratched against the paper, loud in the silence of the room. "Her name will be Evelyn, after my mother," he said. His tone was flat, almost indifferent, as if he were giving instructions to a colleague, not speaking to the woman who had just given birth to his child. My world tilted, and for a moment, everything around me became a blur. We had discussed it, Lena, we had agreed on that name. A soft, beautiful name for our daughter. But here he was, erasing my choice in one swift, cold motion. My mouth felt dry, my mind spinning. "We agreed on Lena, Daniel. Do you remember?" I struggled to sit up, the pain still throbbing, but nothing compared to the sudden weight in my chest. He didn't look up from the paper, his eyes focused entirely on the task before him. "You don't get to decide," he said, the words slow and deliberate, like he was speaking to a child, not his wife. "She's my daughter, and my mother picked that name long before you even knew you were pregnant." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had imagined a day of joy, of shared love and excitement, but instead, I felt like an outsider in my own family. The name, the decision, everything was slipping through my fingers. The baby in my arms, so small, so fragile, had already become a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. I glanced down at my daughter's tiny hand, curled peacefully in my fingers. She had no idea what was happening. She was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that was raging around her. I couldn't even hold her tight enough to protect her from this. From him. From the coldness that was wrapping itself around every part of my life. It was then that the nurse stepped closer. Her presence was quiet, but her eyes held something sharp, something that seemed to see right through the moment. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want me to tell him the truth?" I froze. The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. "What truth?" I asked, my voice trembling, fear crawling up my spine. She hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who was still scribbling away on the form as if everything were perfectly normal. "Not now," she murmured. "But you should know. This isn't as simple as you think." Her words were low, firm, and they shook me to the core. I didn't understand. What could possibly be more complicated than this moment right here? I turned back to Daniel, my mind reeling. Everything about this situation felt wrong. This wasn't just about a name, it was about control, about power. It was as if my life, my choices, my very presence in this family were being dismissed, erased. The pain in my body paled in comparison to the emotional weight that was pressing down on me. I squeezed my daughter's hand, trying to steady myself. The nurse gave me a small, reassuring nod, as if she could sense the storm building inside me. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew, deep down, that I had to fight. For myself. For my daughter. For the future that had been stolen from us both. And in that moment, I realized something that made my heart pound with the truth of it. I couldn't let this go on. I couldn't just accept this. There was too much at stake, too much of myself I had already lost. It was time for me to stand up. Not just for the baby in my arms, but for the woman I used to be, the woman I had to find again. The delicate balance of family dynamics can often be disrupted by forces that are both subtle and powerful. This disruption, when driven by control and manipulation, reveals a dark undercurrent beneath the surface of what might seem like normal family relationships. This battle, one that is often fought silently, can tear at the very fabric of a family, especially when the control comes from within, cloaked under the guise of concern or love. At the heart of this conflict lies Jessica, whose journey through betrayal, control, and manipulation reveals how deeply the emotional ties within a family can be twisted to serve selfish interests. In her case, her husband Daniel and his mother, Patricia, began to weave a web that was designed to push Jessica out of her own life, erasing her presence and claiming the right to control not just her, but also their child. The way they worked together, with Daniel often in the background, complicit in his mother's designs, was chilling. It wasn't just about decisions being made for the child, but about stripping away Jessica's voice, her autonomy, and her very identity as a mother. In the beginning, the power dynamics were subtle. Patricia's influence over Daniel was something Jessica tried to navigate, believing that she could eventually win her place in the family. But with every passing day, the grip grew tighter, and the subtlety began to fade. It started with small gestures, Patricia picking out baby clothes for Jessica, deciding on the baby's name without consulting her, and eventually, when it came time for childbirth, Daniel's decision to ignore everything they had agreed upon. As the months passed, Jessica began to feel more and more like a spectator in her own life. The decisions that were being made, from the choice of hospital to the naming of the child, all seemed to happen without her input, leaving her questioning where she stood in the family she had once believed was a partnership. It wasn't just about her role as a mother, either. Jessica's identity as an equal partner in her marriage was slowly being eroded. Daniel, who had once been her confidant and support, was now becoming a passive participant in the manipulation, unwilling to challenge his mother's overbearing influence. Every time Patricia took another step toward controlling their lives, Daniel's silence spoke volumes. He never once stood up for her. Instead, he would make excuses or brush off her concerns, leaving Jessica feeling isolated and alone, even within the walls of her own home. It became clear that Patricia's grip on their family wasn't just about making decisions for the baby, but about establishing a dynamic where Jessica's presence was no longer necessary. It was as if Patricia, with her well-mannered dominance, had already decided who belonged in her world, and it wasn't Jessica. It was in these moments of isolation that Jessica's inner conflict began to grow. She wanted to maintain peace within her family, especially for the sake of her unborn child, but the constant erosion of her role and voice was taking a toll. The more she tried to assert herself, the more the walls around her seemed to close in. Daniel's indifference, his unwillingness to defend her or their decisions, made her question everything about their marriage. How had things gotten this far? Why had she allowed herself to be sidelined in favor of a mother-in-law who was more concerned with preserving a family legacy than respecting the boundaries of a new, growing family? The turning point came when Jessica was forced to confront the truth. The nurse, who had witnessed the subtle manipulation from the sidelines, leaned in and whispered to her, offering the key to understanding the deeper layers of betrayal. The nurse's revelation about the legal documents and Daniel's manipulation shook Jessica to the core. In that moment, the fight for her identity as a mother was no longer just an emotional battle, it was a legal and moral one. It wasn't just about the name on the birth certificate, it was about her very right to be acknowledged as the mother, a right that Daniel and Patricia had tried to erase. The realization that her husband had been complicit in this deceit hit harder than any physical pain she had experienced during labor. This was the moment when Jessica chose to fight back. With newfound resolve, she tore up the birth certificate, rejecting the control Daniel and Patricia had tried to impose on her. She stood firm, refusing to let them dictate her future or her child's. But this act wasn't just about winning a small battle, it was about reclaiming her dignity, her autonomy, and her voice. For the first time in a long while, Jessica felt like she was taking control of her life, like she was standing up for the family she had dreamed of, not the one her husband and mother-in-law had crafted in their image. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but this was a battle she had to win, not just for herself, but for her child. Jessica's story is not just one of betrayal, it is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within when faced with manipulation and control. It is a lesson in standing up for one's rights, even when the forces against you seem insurmountable. And, ultimately, it's about the power of self-love and resilience. Jessica's decision to take back her power, to tear up the pages of the life she had been forced into, is a testament to the strength that can arise when one chooses to fight for what is rightfully theirs. The quiet, insidious nature of control and manipulation within families often goes unnoticed until the very fabric of the relationship begins to unravel. What was once a seemingly loving dynamic can quickly spiral into a toxic, suffocating situation where one person's needs, desires, and control overshadow the needs of others. For Jessica, this meant enduring the steady removal of her voice in the family, watching as Daniel, the man she once trusted above all others, grew more passive and complicit in Patricia's designs. This passive behavior, though subtle at first, laid the groundwork for an explosive confrontation that would change everything. As the days went on, Jessica's isolation grew. She was no longer allowed to make decisions for her body, her baby, or even her future. Patricia's influence seeped into every decision, from the mundane to the monumental. The baby's name, a symbol of Jessica's love and hope for her child, was stolen from her without so much as a discussion. Each time Patricia made her desires known, Daniel would sigh, brush her off, and say it was no big deal. What Jessica began to realize was that for Daniel, it was easier to appease his mother than to stand by his wife. His actions were not those of a supportive partner, they were the actions of a man too afraid to confront the woman who had raised him, too invested in preserving the peace to see the harm he was causing. And in his silence, Jessica felt more and more like a stranger in her own life. But this realization, though painful, became the catalyst for change. When Jessica confronted Daniel about his role in this manipulation, she was no longer the passive, compliant woman she had been. She had shed that skin, choosing to fight for her rights as a mother. This was not just about the name on a piece of paper, it was about the right to be heard, to be respected, and to be recognized as the person who mattered most in her own family. She no longer accepted being a footnote in a story that was being written by others. In the end, it wasn't just the tearing of the birth certificate that marked Jessica's triumph. It was the quiet strength she found in standing her ground, in finally demanding the respect she deserved. Her story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of self-respect, the strength of the human spirit, and the power of choosing to break free from manipulation, even when it seems impossible. The events that unfolded in the hospital room had shattered Jessica's world in ways she could never have anticipated. But, as she sat there, holding her newborn daughter, Lena, the sting of betrayal began to fade, replaced by a newfound clarity. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was now abundantly clear: she would never again allow anyone to take control of her life, her future, or her child's future. In that moment, Jessica understood that sometimes, the hardest part of moving forward is finding the courage to let go of the past. It hadn't been an easy journey. Every decision, every step, had felt like a battle. The weight of Daniel's silence and his compliance with his mother's plans had crushed her in ways she had never imagined possible. For so long, Jessica had tried to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, always putting everyone else's needs above her own, hoping that one day, her sacrifice would be acknowledged. But it never came. Instead, she was left standing alone, her voice unheard, her identity erased. But now, As she looked down at Lena's tiny face, Jessica felt a fierce protectiveness take root deep in her heart. No longer would she let her life be shaped by the whims of others. The strength she had always carried within her was no longer buried beneath the expectations of her family and her husband. It had surfaced in the most unexpected of ways, forged in the fires of betrayal and heartbreak. The realization of her own power came slowly, like a fog lifting from her mind. She could still feel the weight of those moments, the coldness of Daniel's eyes as he signed Evelyn's name on the birth certificate, the shock in the nurse's voice when she had offered the truth, the hollow emptiness of her own heart when she realized how far Daniel and Patricia had gone to control her. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered now was the strength she had gained from those moments. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She had reclaimed her voice, and with it, her agency. Standing up for herself had been the hardest thing Jessica had ever done. It had been easier, at first, to stay quiet, to let things slide, to avoid confrontation. But once she learned the truth, once she saw the lengths to which Daniel and his mother had gone, it became impossible to stay silent. The actions they had taken were an insult, not just to her, but to the life she had built with Daniel. And yet, despite everything, there was a strange sense of peace that had settled in her heart. She was no longer trapped in a toxic relationship, one that threatened to suffocate her. She was free. Free from the constant demands of Patricia, free from Daniel's manipulation, and free from the suffocating grip of guilt that had long been her constant companion. No longer would she allow anyone to define her worth. No longer would she let her love for her daughter be questioned or diminished by the manipulative forces of her past. She would be the mother Lena deserved, a mother who could guide her through life with love, with strength, and with an unshakable sense of self-worth. The weeks that followed were not easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and an overwhelming sense of fear about the future. But there was also joy. Small moments of joy, like Lena's first smile, the way she curled her tiny fingers around Jessica's hand, the sound of her soft breaths as she slept peacefully in her arms. These were the moments that made all the pain worth it. These were the moments that reminded Jessica of why she had fought so hard. As she walked out of the hospital, Lena nestled in her arms, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had spent too long carrying the burden of other people's expectations. Now, she was walking into the future, ready to embrace whatever it held. The past was behind her, and in its place was a new beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was, but for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt like she had the strength to face whatever came next. Daniel's absence in that moment spoke volumes. He had been a part of her life for so long, but now, his silence and his absence were all the confirmation she needed. The man who had promised to support her, to be her partner, had chosen a path that led him away from her. And in doing so, he had given her the freedom she so desperately needed. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation, no more control. Jessica would raise Lena on her own terms, with love, with boundaries, and with a sense of purpose. Life after that wasn't perfect. There were still moments of struggle, moments when Jessica doubted herself, when she wondered if she was making the right decisions. But there was also a deep sense of empowerment that came from knowing she was in control of her own destiny. For the first time, she was making decisions for herself, and for Lena, based on what was right, not what others wanted or expected. The divorce was just a formality after everything had unfolded, but it was a necessary step in reclaiming her own life. Daniel didn't contest it. He didn't show up to the mediation or fight for custody. He had made his choice, and now, he would face the consequences. He lost everything, not because of Jessica's actions, but because of his own choices, his own inability to stand up for what was right. Jessica's story wasn't one of revenge. It wasn't about hurting Daniel or Patricia. It was about reclaiming her voice, her identity, and her freedom. It was about choosing to live her life on her own terms, to create a world for Lena where love and respect were the foundation, not control and manipulation. As she settled into her new life, Jessica realized that the true victory wasn't in what she had lost, it was in what she had gained. She had gained the freedom to be herself, the strength to stand up for her daughter, and the peace that came from knowing she had done the right thing. She was no longer a passive observer in her own life, she was the one writing her story now. And so, as Jessica walked hand in hand with Lena through the park, watching her daughter discover the world for the first time, she knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter, a new life, free from the chains of her past, was waiting for them both. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt hopeful. She felt like she had a future worth looking forward to, a future where she was in control, where her voice was heard, and where love, not fear, would guide them both forward.